Killer, good morning everyone, Rich1 here. Welcome back to the channel. Today we are going to have a look at the new Tamron 24mm f2.8 and also the 35mm f2.8 lens for the Sony E-mount cameras. Tamron also has a 20mm f2.8 lens which has a very similar design, very similar size, which I will be reviewing very soon. So if you haven't subscribed to my channel yet, subscribe now so that you won't miss my review. Okay, let's start the review by talking about the body design and build quality of these two lenses first. These two lenses has a very similar body design. They are both quite compact and also quite lightweight. While they may not be the smallest or the lightest lens for the Sony E-mount system, they are small enough that I'm happy to carry both of them in my camera bag even when I want to travel light with a small camera bag. The construction of these two lenses are definitely a little bit plastic, but they are very good quality plastic. And if you look at the rear of the lens, and you can see a very shiny and very solid lens mount, and this is the same for both of these lenses. Both of these lenses come with a lens hood. The one on the 24mm is the very typical reversible one, while the one on the 35mm is a little bit unusual. It is actually not a reversible one, and if you look at it, there is actually a rectangular cutout shape in the center of it. So that actually reminds me of the size 35mm f2.8 lens for the Sony E-mount, which was the first lens I bought for my Sony E camera. So yeah, very similar lens hood design for these two 35mm f2.8 lenses. Both lenses takes the 67mm front filter, and it looks like this is the favorite filter size that Tamron prefer, because the 20mm f2.8 lens also use the 67mm front filter. And not only that, the Tamron 17 to 28mm f2.8 lens, which I reviewed a little while ago, also uses the 67mm front filter. And also the other Tamron, the Tamron 28 to 75 2.8 lens for the E-mount is also uses the 67mm front filter. So I'm pretty sure that Tamron just purposely make all the new lenses take the 67mm front filter so that you can share the filter between all these lenses. If you look at the rear of the lens, there is a little rubber seal around the edge of the lens mount, and according to Tamron, there are also a few extra rubber seal that is inside the lens. But instead of saying these two lenses are weather resistant, Tamron just called it moisture resistant. I don't really know what's the difference between moisture resistant and weather resistant, but it seems like Tamron just prefer to use the term moisture resistance, as this is the term that they use to describe the lenses that has rubber seal around the lens. The lenses has a fluorine coating on the front element, which should help to improve the protection against dust or some water spot or even a fingerprint that you may leave on the front element. And in terms of the autofocus performance, I will be honest and I'll tell you that both lenses autofocus is not particularly fast and also not very quiet as well. And also when it's trying to lock onto the target, you can see the focus would wobble a little bit when it's trying to lock onto the target. So definitely not the most snappy or the fastest lens in terms of the autofocus operation. But then if you are just using these lenses to take some everyday photo or maybe some landscape or a bit of portrait, then the slightly slower autofocus speed shouldn't be a problem at all. I've also mounted these two lenses on my Nikon Z6 using the TechArt TZE01 adapter, and I found something quite interesting. And what I mean is the autofocus performance seems to be a little bit faster than compared to when I just mounted onto the A7 III directly, and also the autofocus seems to be a little bit smoother as well. So apart from the very occasionally the autofocus will fail to lock onto the target on the Z6, but otherwise the overall autofocus performance is at least as good as if I mounted on the A7 III. So if you are a Nikon shooter, or if you are a Sony and Nikon dual brand shooter, you can definitely consider mounting this lens onto your Nikon body using the TechArt TZE01 adapter. And if you have never heard of the TechArt adapter before, I have done the review previously, so I put a link here so that you can check out my review of the TechArt adapter. Okay, now let's talk about the image quality, and as usual, let's start with the image sharpness first, and let's talk about the 24mm lens first. With the 24mm lens, if you look at the center sharpness, at the maximum aperture f2.8, the center sharpness is already excellent. And even if we move on and look at the edges and the corner, the sharpness at f2.8 is also pretty good. And if you look at the 35mm lens, once again, very similar. Even at the maximum aperture f2.8, the center sharpness is already excellent. And if we move on and look at the edges and the corners, it's still very good, but I may say it's slightly softer when you compare to the 24mm lens. So once you stop down to f4, then even the corner edges is already very sharp. If I'm using either of these lenses to take landscape photo and I don't need a very deep depth of field, then I would be pretty happy to just shoot at the maximum aperture f2.8, as the sharpness is pretty good from center all the way to the edges, and at most I may just stop down a little bit to f4, then I could get excellent image sharpness from edge to edge. Next, I want to talk about the bokeh. Now, normally, if it's for a 24mm or 35mm lens with the f2.8 maximum aperture, I don't really care too much about the bokeh, because the chance that you can dissolve the background when shooting with this kind of lenses is not very common. But because these two lenses, they can actually do macro photos or 1:2 magnification macro photo or close-up photo, so you still can dissolve the background when you are taking a close-up photo. So let's have a look at the bokeh quality and look at the 24mm first. At the maximum aperture, the bokeh is quite smooth and round, and if you stop down a little bit and stop down to around f5.6, then you can start to see some straight line in the bokeh because of its 7 aperture braid design. And for the 35mm lens, the bokeh looks very similar to the 24mm lens. It's reasonably smooth and round at the maximum aperture, but there is a little bit more cat's eye effect. In terms of the flare control, both lenses have very good flare control. When I'm shooting directly into the sun during the day, there is very minimal amount of lens flare or ghosting. And even when I test these lenses at night and shoot into a very bright object with a very dark background, normally for a lot of lenses you would see a lot of lens flare and very obvious ghosting. But with these two lenses, there is a little bit of ghosting and a little bit of lens flare, but the amount of lens flare and ghosting is definitely better than the average lenses. Okay, next let's talk about the distortion. And with the 24mm lens, there is definitely quite a bit of distortion. Unfortunately, the amount of distortion is more than what I would expect from a 24mm prime lens. If you look at this test photo, you can definitely see there is quite a bit of distortion with this 24mm lens. And when you use this lens to take the real world photo, so it really depends on what kind of photo you're taking. For some of the photo I shot, even some of them with very straight line near the edge, I do not actually see a lot of distortion, but some other photos, then you would see quite a bit of distortion. So you definitely have to be a bit careful if you want to use this 24mm lens to take some landscape photo with maybe, for example, a lot of buildings, especially you have some very straight line near the edge of the frame. Otherwise, you may have to apply a bit of distortion control when you're editing the photo. But on the other hand, with the 35mm lens, the amount of distortion is very minimal. Even with my brick wall test photo, you don't really see a lot of distortion. And when I look at all my other real world photos that I shot with this 35mm lens, I see almost no distortion at all. Vignetting is noticeable at the maximum aperture f2.8 with both lenses. Stop down to f4 would improve the vignetting quite a lot, but if you want to have very minimal vignetting, then you have to stop down to f5.6 on both lenses. Chromatic aberration is very well controlled with both these lenses. Looking at the high contrast photo that I shot using these two lenses at the maximum aperture, I see very minimal amount of color fringing in all my sample photos. The macro capability is definitely a very big selling point for these two lenses. While they may not be the real 1:1 macro lenses, they can still offer the 1:2 maximum magnification, which is a lot better than most other similar prime lenses in the market. For example, the size 35 f2.8 lens, the maximum magnification is only 0.12 times, which is a lot lower than the 0.5 times, or in other words 1:2 that these two lenses can offer. And when you use these two lenses to take some close-up or macro photo, the image quality is very nice. Your subject will be very sharp and the background will be dissolved very nicely with very beautiful bokeh. The only issue that I found when taking macro photo is that with the 24mm lens, when I want to take the really close-up photo, the 1:2 magnification ratio photo, then the lens has to get to very close to the subject. So there are two problems because of that. First is that it's quite easy that the lens would cast some shadow on the subject that you are shooting, so you have to be really careful with the lighting, and it will be also be quite hard to light up your subject even if you have external lighting or flash, because the lens just get very close to the subject. And also if you want to use it to take some photo of inserts or something, that it will be quite tricky because your lens is very close to your subject. But other than that, I find it really handy that I can just use any of these lenses to take some nice close-up for macro photos. And if you love to have sun stars in your photo, then you can stop down the lens to around f11, then you can start to have some sun stars. But if you want the most beautiful, very nice and sharp sun star, then you need to stop down to the minimum aperture f22, then you can have some beautiful sun stars in your photo. Okay, now let's come to the conclusion of this review. I know some people would ask, why a 24 or 35mm f2.8 prime lens? Because f2.8 is not exactly a very fast prime lens. Even Tamron themselves, they have the 17-28 f2.8 zoom lens or the 28-75 f2.8 zoom lens. So these two prime lenses actually are not any faster than those zoom lenses. So who are these prime lenses designed for? I have been carrying these two lenses with me pretty much every day in my camera bag for a little while, and I think they are actually very good everyday lenses, and there are many reasons for that. The first one is they are pretty compact and pretty light, so I definitely didn't mind having them in my camera bag. I have a pretty small camera bag and I can fit both lenses in my camera bag, and I carry them every day, even some of the days I wasn't really planning to take any photo, but they are so light. If you mount it onto the A7, it's a pretty small and pretty light package, so definitely very good as an everyday lens because it's something that I wouldn't mind carry with me every day. And if you have watched some of my previous video, you will know that 35mm is my personal favorite focal length. So to me, between these two lenses, I would definitely pick the 35mm lens as my everyday lens. And as I mentioned before, the size 35 f2.8 lens was my first lens that I bought for my Sony A7. And if I have to buy it again, I would probably pick the Tamron 35 f2.8 because it is quite a bit cheaper, and I don't think the image quality is any worse than the size lens. Even though the size lens does have better build quality, and also the size is a little bit more compact compared to the Tamron, but overall I think the cheaper price and the just as good image quality would make me want to get this Tamron over the size lens. And speaking of the image quality, I think the overall image quality of these two lenses are definitely very good, especially if you consider their very affordable price. My only complaint in terms of the image quality would be the distortion for the 24mm lens, which is definitely a little bit more than what I would like to see on a 24mm prime lens. But otherwise, everything is pretty good. The image is very sharp from center all the way to the edges. The chromatic aberration is very well controlled. Same thing for the flare, very well controlled. Vignetting is a bit noticeable at the maximum aperture, but not bad enough that I would want to complain about. And it also has quite beautiful bokeh and sun star as well. I could use these lenses to take some landscape photo or a bit of environmental portrait or some just everyday photo or even street photography. And because of its 1 to 2 macro capability, I can also use it to take some very nice close-up or macro photos, and the image quality, no matter what kind of photo that I'm taking, will still be very good. And that's what I think is a very good everyday lens. And if I want to do a bit of travel photography, I would be happy to have both lenses in my camera bag, so I can use the 24mm to cover the wide angle side of the photo, and then the 35mm to do the more standard-ish focal length. So with these two lenses in my camera bag, it's still a pretty light and small camera bag. Or maybe if the Tamron 20mm f2.8 lens quality is just as good as the 24mm, I could even swap the 24 with the 20, so I can even cover a slightly wider angle and keep the 35mm. So yeah, I can have a bit of more different focal length to cover different kind of photos. Do you guys think these two Tamron lenses would be good everyday lenses? Or what is your ideal everyday lens? Do you have a favorite everyday lens for your camera? Let me know in the comment fields below. Thank you very much for watching this video, and I'll see you in my next video.